Well, welcome back, everyone. Thank you for joining us. It is now my pleasure to introduce the next speaker on the agenda. Bienvenue, Consul General Sylvain Fabi. It's wonderful to have you here. Consul General Fabi joined the Consulate General of Canada in Denver in October of 2020 in the heart of COVID. So he hasn't had a proper introduction to our community, I'm afraid. His career with Global Affairs Canada has spanned various geographic and trade policy divisions, which we are excited about. And also he included assignments in Moscow, Havana, Santiago, Jamaica, and the Bahamas, where he served as High Commissioner for Canada. Not bad posts, I would say. Before becoming Consul General in Denver, he was the Executive Director of the U.S. Transboundary Affairs Division. And in his current role as Canada's Consul General in the U.S. Mountain West region, Mr. Fabi oversees a team of 18 who are wonderful people to work with. They work with Colorado, Kansas, Montana, Utah, and Wyoming to strengthen trade and economic ties, enhance political and academic and cultural links, and assist Canadians visiting or living in the 5-state territory. He is Canada's chief negotiator for the modernization of Columbia River Treaty with the United States. We are in great honor of your presence, Mr. Consul General. Thank you so much for joining us today. And we look forward to hearing your remarks. I'll be moderating some Q&A and I'll give you a 5-minute warning when you need it.
All right.
Thank you.
Can you hear me well now? Okay. Well, thank you so much, Karen. I'm very happy to be here. I just love to be given opportunities to interact with people who are younger than me. It includes you, Karen, but I'm especially talking about people who are attending this presentation. So today, what I'll try. Oh, and so do we have the presentation on now?
Yes, the presentation is on and it'll be advanced for you. So all you need to do is ask for the next slide.
Okay, so you can go to slide number 2 where it says purpose. And so what I want to do today is to demonstrate, why do we do trade, try to help illustrate the depth of the Canada-U.S. relationship before we get into the USMCA trade issues and key sectors. And also, I know that many of you are interested in opportunities to study abroad, travel abroad, work overseas for international companies and diplomacy. So at the end of my presentation, if Karen succeeds in keeping me honest with time, I'll be pleased to spend some minutes to discuss my career in international relations and especially answer some of the questions you may have. So if we go to the next slide. So like I said, we'll talk about trade a little bit and the why and the what. So next slide, where you see a big US blue map. As you know, the landmark NAFTA agreement that we had signed with the US and Mexico a while ago was extremely beneficial to the 3 countries. And the new USMCA builds upon those successes and create new opportunities in the modern economy. It's not a completely new agreement. A lot of what it's in the USMCA was before, but it's been upgraded, amended to reflect, where we are in our commercial relationship. And so what we're doing is we've tried to find areas where we could adapt the agreement to a more modern trade relationship. And frankly, the new agreement is top notch. It compares favorably to any kind of agreements that exist in the world today. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see a burger. We chose the burger image to explain how our supply chains are so integrated. And a good example is because it's an example of how Canada and the US not only sell to one another, but also that we make things together, and that includes lunch. So a couple of factoids for you while you look at the picture is, give examples of how our the network of supply chain between countries increase our competitiveness in the global economy. So 78% or close to 80% of total US imports from Canada are raw material, parts, and services used to make goods and services in the US, right? So that's important to remember. We make things together, and a lot of what we export to the US is used for the US to do something else with it and then sell it either in the US, in Canada, or somewhere else in the world. And the Canada-U.S. cross-border trade between firms is almost $500 billion alone, right? So that's $500 billion a year. So that's the trade between firms. And US imports to Canada account for more than 10% Canadian exports to the rest of the world, right? So 14.6 billion. So all of this to say, these numbers are there to highlight that we have very highly integrated supply chains, and they are quite efficient, and that a significant majority of our daily use products are made seamlessly together, right? The example we often give is you can have a car part that goes into a car that could cross the border 5-6 times before the car is over. So we send you something, you make something with it, you send it back to Canada, it's assembled into a bigger system of the car, and then it goes back to the US. So you see this, it's important that we have a free trade established between our two countries. The same is true with beef. You can have cattle born in Canada, fed and raised in the US, sent back to Canada to be slaughtered, and sent back to the US to be processed, or any combination of these. And that's why, it's important to remember when we do our job as government officials that our supply chains are quite integrated, right? And on average, Canadian exports of manufactured goods to the US contain a quarter of US content. So if we sell you a finished product, on average, it has 25% US content. So it's not completely, a pure Canadian product competing with a pure American product. So if we go to the next slide, we want to talk a little bit about Buy America. The first thing is, Buy America is when the U.S. Takes measures to use federal funding that can be used only by contracting or buying from U.S. providers, right? So which in turn excludes Canadian exporters or providers of services. So of course we understand that the global domestic content laws are to boost U.S. production, but it's important to remember that it has unintended consequences downstream. So Canada shares the US's desire, of course, to support workers and jobs, but applying domestic content requirements like Buy America against Canadian inputs sometimes has the opposite effect that was intended. They negatively impact US jobs and affect US companies and workers that rely on cross-border supply chains, what I spoke about earlier. And Canada and the US share similar business climates and workforces, and workers in both the US and Canada belong to the same unions often. Businesses have operations on both sides and need to move their material back and forth. In essence, it is better to face these tough problems, economic problems, together and to solve them with a holistic North American approach, right? So the other slide are bilateral partnership. Here, and other slide again, it's important to notice that our relationship goes deeper than buying and selling stuff, right? But even though it's a big part of it. So in 2020, under pandemic conditions, the US imports of goods and services from Canada were 305 billion. The US has a trade surplus in goods and services with Canada. So you actually sell more to Canada than we sell to you, but it's a small amount. It's about $2.2 billion. So it kind of reflects an almost perfectly reciprocal trading relationship. And this is what trade looks like from a Canadian standpoint. You know, our relatively smaller economy cannot produce all goods and services cheaply. So we need to trade to have choices. Our natural resources ground our trade, as do major sectors like auto and aviation. Canada cannot achieve a globally efficient allocation of resources based on the size of our population. It's about 1/10 of the US population. So we need to produce and trade on a larger platform, whether North America or globally. And Canada once had a more closed economy with higher tariffs, you know, but decades of liberalizations have stimulated productivity and generated, you know, very widespread gains. So the next slide. Canada and the US, remember, enjoy the closest relationship between any two countries in the world. This is certainly true in terms of trade and investment, but it goes way beyond that. Like, we're friends, we're allies, we're partners, and this enduring partnership is built on, of course, common geography, history, culture, and values. And most important of all, it's also built on mutual respect. And together, we benefit from robust trade and investment ties and integrated economies that support millions of jobs, not just in Canada, but in both countries. And no two nations depend more on each other for their mutual prosperity and security than the United States. We live in and protect the same area, right? North America. And of the 50 US states, 46 of them count Canada as their first, second, or third important export market. So we're a big partner for everyone in the US. And I would be tempted to say that the US-Canada trade relationship is actually a model for the world. It's growing, it's balanced, it's fair, and it supports growth, innovation, and good paying jobs in both countries. So if you go to the next slide, you have a little bit of a commercial relationship with Colorado, just to make it a little bit more closer to you. So Canada, of course, is Colorado's #1 trading partner and export market. And as you can see here, 252 Canadian companies employ almost 21,000 Coloradans. That's only the surface part of the story. When you calculate purchasing and exports, trade with Canada supports approximately 65,000 jobs in these states. We use a lot of these statistics to try to illustrate to the importance of our shared relationship. So in 2020, Canada and Colorado traded approximately 4.2 billion in goods, and that's with the pandemic and economic crisis. You know, there is a it's a relationship that benefits Colorado workers tremendously and generates prosperity for this economy. The reverse is true too for Canada. And Colorado also sold another $1.3 billion in services. We often overlook services, but as our economies mature more and more, services are a huge part of our relationship. So if we go to the next slide, so industry success. We took a couple of examples. Go to the next slide again. A little bit of we took a couple of examples to illustrate, our bilateral relationships, and And the first one is energy integration. And you can look at all these maps and all the pipelines that already exist, the gas lines, etc. So it gives a good example that how we share our energy. Often it's easy to share energy or anything else for that matter, north-south, than it is to do it east-west, sometimes for reasons of proximity. So Canada, of course, is the largest supplier of all forms of energy to the US. Canadian exports to the US amounted to the equivalent of powering almost 6 million US homes. Also, we give you this to, more than the population of Colorado. And even as total US crude oil imports have fallen in recent years, imports from Canada have continued to increase. And of course, Canada is by far the largest source of US crude oil imports. We provide more than half of your total exports in 2019, which equals 21% of US total consumption of crude oil. You export a lot more crude oil than you do from any other country, whether it's Saudi Arabia, Russia, Venezuela, all the oil producers. And remember, there are 70 transborder pipelines. You can see some of them on the map here. 31 are for oil and 39 are for natural gas. And Canada's electricity sector is an important source for the US. We've signed recently huge electricity export contracts in the East with the state of New York and Massachusetts. And that electricity that we produce is very clean. Most of it is from hydroelectric generation, so it's not an emitting source. So if we go to the next slide, clean technology is another very growing sector in our bilateral relationship. The global market is now worth about $2 trillion per year. It's huge and it's rapidly growing, and we need to be invested in them for the future. And sharing knowledge and technology will help us, meet our climate goals. So, and due to boasting a highly educated workforce as well as abundant natural resources, Canada has become a global leader in clean tech. However, a global problem requires a global solution, and we are always willing and excited to work with our American partners in a knowledge exchange that benefits both nations. So here in Colorado, 30% of the state's energy consumption came from wind and solar in 2020. And Canada, for example, is home to over 300 wind farms. So more wind energy has been built in Canada over the last 5 years than any other form of electricity generation, with installed capacity growing by an average of 16% per year. That's not insignificant. As a result, Canada is a major player on the global scene, ranking 9th in the world for total installed wind energy capacity. And that's why we're involved in working together with partners in the US to grow this even more, whether it's here in the US and Canada or anywhere else around the world. The next slide is aerospace. And in our region, another important industry for bilateral trade is aerospace, as I said. Colorado is where NORAD is based. NORAD is North American organization to protect our airspace and our sea space, headquartered at Peterson Air Space Force in Colorado Springs. And nowhere is our special defense relationship more personified than right here in Colorado. NORAD is headed by both American and Canadian officers. And of course, aerospace is a critical pillar of Colorado's economy, especially along the Front Range. For example, in Kansas, aerospace and aircraft are one of the most dynamic aspects of our trading relationship. We're also responsible to cover Kansas. And we have significant investment in that sector. Next slide is about agriculture. It's another key sector for trade between the US Mountain West region and Canada. And Canada is also an important partner contributing to your food security. And our exports help US supply chains operate more effectively and create job and boost US global exports. And as noted on the slide, the USMCA has strengthened agricultural trade between our countries and enabled farmers and ranchers in the region to expand their exports to the reliable Canadian market. And in fact, US agricultural exports to Canada have increased 112% in the last 15 years, right? So next slide, what comes next in our relationship? I'm almost done. So Karen, I should be good. If you go to the map, the slide that says roadmap for a renewed partnership, you see a picture of Prime Minister Trudeau and President Biden. They both announced in February of this year what they call a roadmap to a renewed Canada-U.S. partnership. It's basically a blueprint for an ambitious effort in support of our mutual goals, right? And some of these goals, they're written there: combating COVID, building back better, accelerating climate ambitions, advancing diversity and inclusion, et cetera, and of course, bolstering security and defense, right? That's an interesting document that you can Google and read if you're interested in. It's not a very big document. If you're interested in Canada-U.S. relations, because it kind of sets the tone to where our two leaders want to take that relationship, to a higher level. So my second to last slide, the final takeaway. Why did I talk to you about this today is to highlight the importance and depth of the Canada-U.S. relationship. And it goes far beyond any single trade dispute or challenge or whatever. And the foundations of this relationship are solid and unbreakable. And Canada and the United States aren't just neighbors, we're family. We built this continent together, and it will always be our home together. So next slide. I'm done for today presenting to you. I'm glad that I tried to go fast because I know you guys will probably want to ask questions, and I'd like to be able to answer some of them. So,
well,
Karen.
Thank you, Consul General. We do have some great questions that came in through the Q&A feature. If you haven't had a chance to put your question in, please do so. First question is, what was the most interesting or impactful negotiation in your career?
Well, by far, the most interesting negotiation is the one I'm doing now. As the Canada's chief negotiator for the modernization of the Columbia River Treaty. Columbia River Treaty is a treaty where Canada and the US agreed that Canada would build dams and control the flows of the Columbia River better so that we could avoid catastrophic floods that had occurred in the US as a result of the snow melt in the spring. And so these were too frequent and had to be addressed. And two, manage the flows of the Columbia River to maximize electricity production in the US for dams in the Columbia River. A lot of people don't know, but the Columbia River is one of the greatest center of electricity production in the world, certainly in North America. And Canada, under the CRT, we work together to try to maximize that. Now, it's an interesting negotiations because, as you will realize, in 1963, when the first treaty was signed, there weren't a lot of consideration that were given to the environment, ecosystems, but also to the relationship with our Indigenous peoples. So this time around, we will modernize the treaty, and what we try to do is make it more respectful for the environment and certainly more inclusive. At least I can speak for Canada. We have engaged in this negotiation by very seriously working with, not consulting, working with the Indigenous nations as equal partners to develop Canadian positions and bring the Indigenous nations of the basin to the table of
I love
negotiations
that.
with the U.S.
That
So
must
it's a real thing. Now, the proof is in the pudding. We'll have to wait until we're done to see whether, but the process that we've engaged into is very good. So it's very gratifying to have the chance to work on a file like this.
That's wonderful. I love that. Great. Well, let's go to your next question. How do you think Canada and the U.S. can further improve our trade relations?
Well, I think the pandemic. There's many ways, right? I think the pandemic has definitely demonstrated that the integrity of supply chains can go down the drain pretty fast when a big event like a pandemic happens. Both countries worked unbelievably well during the crisis to make sure that the efficiency and the fluidity of our supply chains would be salvaged, and it worked. It didn't with other countries. There were some major breakups, and the best example is in protective equipment for health workers, and hopefully when we build back better, and if you look at the roadmap that I showed earlier in my presentation, part of it is to build back better and ensure that our supply chains are even more shielded and resistant to such outside forces to be maintained in these times of crisis. Of course, another thing that I spoke about in my presentation is try to avoid, and it goes for both countries, try to avoid putting measures that at first glance appear to be good for us, like Buy America, when in the end it may not be that good, and we should try to avoid and maybe put some measures in place to avoid falling into the same pitfalls that we do every 5, 6, 7, 10 years. Oh, we have a great idea. We'll just put tariffs, right? And it'll work. Absolutely. It never has.
Never has.
But,
never will. So, I'm with you on that one.
Knew you would.
All right, next one. How does Colorado compare to other states when it comes to trading with Canada?
Well, Colorado is usually, if you look at the size of trade, it's very often linked to the size of the respective economy of a state, right?
Oh, that's funny. Does that correlate?
So, for example, and of course it depends. Like if you take the state of Michigan, right? It's a bigger state than Colorado. It's on the border with Canada, and also it has the car industry. So the commercial relationship we have with Michigan is completely skewed. Like we trade more with Michigan than any other country of the world almost, except China or something, and of course the U.S. But Colorado fares well. We're not a border state, right? But like I said in my presentation, for almost all states of the U.S., we're the first, second, and sometimes third trading partners. So the trading relationship is good. There's always room to improve, right?
Yeah, of course. I think we can improve our trade. So we'll keep working at it. Let's go to the next question. How does Canada compare to Germany in terms of clean energy tech, the clean tech industry, and trade regarding this sector?
Yeah, this is a multi-pronged question. Like Germany is a very advanced country in terms of clean tech, right? But with Canada, with the hundreds of wind farms that we have installed, we've developed a good knowledge base and capacity. But we still have to import some of the parts and probably not the knowledge, because now we've gotten good at it. So we're quite involved in that area. Certainly in terms of clean clean electricity, because we are blessed, especially Quebec and BC and Manitoba, we're blessed with big rivers. So we were able to create big electricity producing dams, and now we export billions of dollars to the US in electricity. So we're quite advanced in that sector too. Canada's an advanced economy, so not unlike I don't know, France, the UK, Germany. We have capacity in most sectors, but I think in Canada, wind is a good one. We know there's activity in all the sectors. You chose Germany as a comparison, so not many countries look super awesome in terms of clean tech when it's time to compare them with Germany, but we're way up there.
All right, fantastic. Going back to your America First conversation, we have a question about that. When America First or any other trade reducing policies come up on either side, US or Canada, what are the procedural steps that you or someone in your position might take as far as mitigating those significant negative impacts on trade and protecting existing business channels? Look at
That's a good question.
Questions. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it highlights a lot of the work that we do at the consulate, right? At all, we have 15 consulates in the US, and we have the embassy in Washington. The US is a sovereign country, so the US can do whatever it wants, right? So there's no, unless it contradicts a treaty that was signed between Canada and the US, Canada has to revert to diplomacy and trying to share information, etc. So a lot of what we do is these laws, for example, are voted in Congress, right? So I talk to a lot of senators and representatives to try to offer the other side of the medal. Sometimes we come up with clear examples of, hey, just think about it, right? If these new measures are introduced, this is going to hurt your state or your riding or whatever. And so we do a lot of work on the diplomatic side. And then at the end of the day, I'll give you an example. If Canada passed in the last budget we announced a measure that would kind of, in the end, provide a tit for tat, which is the last place we want to go. But if we are at our last resort, we'll do that. And if you look at statistics, the US gets more US companies gets more contracts from Canadian governments than Canadian companies do in the US. So if you impose something and then we put in place a countervailing measure, in the end, never mind what happens to the supply chains.
Yeah,
you're going to lose more. So
we both are harmed for sure.
Yeah, so there's a lot of work behind this. Our embassy, and between when the Prime Minister speaks to the President, when our Minister speaks to the Secretary of State or the Secretary, the U.S. Trade Representative or Commerce, we try to reach a solution, and usually we do. Sometimes not. The timing is not the best, but we usually come to a conclusion that there's a better way of doing things, and it's together.
Absolutely. Thanks for saying that. Are you open for a couple more questions? We have.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm open. Anything you want.
It sounds like somebody's asking in from Brazil. We have about 10 plus different countries participating today, so it's fantastic. So as you may know, Brazil has a huge number of wind energy parks, around 600. Is there any negotiation or interest in doing or selling equipment to their market?
I'm sure there is. Okay. I don't want to say yes, A, B, C, D, because I don't have clear examples. But I know that I used to be the director for bilateral relationships between Canada and Brazil years ago. And I know that one of the things Canada's been trying really hard to do is, and Brazil too, is significantly widen and increase our commercial investment and research joint work. It's a little harder because, you know, Brazil is further and Canada's further from Brazil, and we have to meet in between and you know, the language barriers, etc. But there's a lot of there's a lot of room for increasing, and I'm sure that there are Canadian parts that go into windmill and Brazilian parts that go into Canadian windmills.
For sure.
I don't have the proof, but I'd be very surprised if it was not the case, right?
For sure.
So,
well, let's change geographies and go over to Iceland, if you would. Do you know how your clean tech industry compares to Iceland's by chance? Got another question from there.
I wish I could answer that. I don't know.
Okay, let's go back.
I know Iceland is quite advanced in that, and also Iceland is one of the most advanced places in the world for geothermal.
That's right.
Which is clean, which of course Canada can't really compare to that, right? But right. I can't go further than that. I'm sorry.
Okay, no problem. Okay, let's go back to supply chain. And how do you think that these supply chain challenges might impact our future as trading partners? Do you think there might be an opportunity in this? I always think that there's innovation and opportunity when things get difficult. So there's a question about that. Should we look at it as an opportunity to improve?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's in the work plan that I spoke earlier, right? Like I said earlier, people take supply chains for granted until the chain stops, which in some areas it did with COVID, and in others it didn't, but they were hard to keep in place, and we had to make major efforts and very serious exemptions, for example, at the border to allow the chains to function. So obviously, every time a crisis happens, it's unfortunate, but in any aspect of life, if something bad happens, we try and should always look for ways to improve, and the opportunity definitely is there. What I'm sometimes, I mean, this is not the government representative speaking, just the person, you know, unfortunately, too often we have great opportunities to do something, and then we get caught up in day-to-day life and we forget about it. And then 10 years later, something happens again, and we said, oh boy, I wish we'd use the opportunity of COVID to improve our supply chains or reinforce them so that they would be more resistant to outside events. And we didn't. So I hope we are talking about doing this. It's in the plan, etc. But again, the proof will be in the pudding.
All right, that's a great point. I have a question for you, just for our audience. Many of our audience is probably interested in a diplomatic career, I would assume. So, what advice would you give to new college students, maybe soon to graduate, who are looking to enter the diplomacy service? What advice would you give them to actually just get prepared for that type of career?
Yeah. Well, in Canada, like in the US, and I know it's the case in Brazil too, and in many other countries, there's a mechanical part to becoming a diplomat, right? You got to write the exam, you got to be, you know, in Brazil, I know there's a world famous Foreign Affairs Institute you have to get into, and so there's the mechanical part of it. In Canada, you have to be a university graduate, you have to apply. We're just about to launch another competition now for new recruits. The same in the Foreign Service. So the thing is you have to be aware of how you can enter, and this information is available, especially now with the internet. So you gotta start looking at it and say, okay, that's what I want to do. How do I do it, right? So there's this part, and then you got to write the exam, you got to pass it. There's other avenues. You can usually, sometimes in Canada, you can come in, laterally also. But the other thing too is it's probably the same in many other countries, but any department now in the US and in Canada has an international division working in it. And a lot of what they do is kind of diplomatic. And also these other departments will actually send people to work in embassies, right? Whether it's commerce, agriculture, etc. So you got to be aware of that. And of course, there's all sorts of other things that are probably more particular to any country. I know that in Canada, the apprenticeship of both official languages will help you get in. But in the US, you have only one official language, so that if you don't speak French, it's usually not a hurdle to joining the State Department. But also the last thing I'll say, Karen, is patience, right? Because patience, and because these processes are long, but also look in other places. A lot of development agencies have people working abroad. They don't work in embassies, but boy, their work is just as gratifying as being a diplomat. There's also in business, right? And a lot of international business, more and more business is international. Right. So you can't, because of the complexity and luck, right? Of that you need through these big competitions to work at the State Department or at Global Affairs Canada or at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Brazil. There's an element of luck when 10,000 people write the exam and they take 28 that year, right?
Of course.
So don't put all your eggs in that basket.
Right. So also internships with the World Trade Center might help differentiate you, or an ISEC traineeship, or an internship with the Consulate General of Canada. So
absolutely, you got to grasp at these things.
You got to grasp at them.
And then one day you may not become a diplomat, but you may become someone who works for the World Bank or
that's right.
For
That's right. All right. Well, Mr. Consul General, thank you so much for your time. That brings our session to a close. I want to thank you again for being with us today, and thank you for your service to furthering ties between the U.S. and Canada. We appreciate you and all that you and your team do. So
thank you so much, and I'm always happy to join your events, and especially when it involves talking to people who are going to be replacing us soon.
Awesome. I agree. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.